Hello, I'm Brett Rutherford from the Mersey Bluff Church of Christ, and we meet every Sunday at 232 William Street at 9:30 for worship in the morning. And you're welcome to join us there for that worship service. That is followed by a period of Bible class at 10:45. That begins, and then on Sunday evening we also have another service on, so we'd welcome you to come along to that at 6 p.m. at that same address, 232 William Street. We'd also encourage you to come to our midweek Bible study. That's every Wednesday rather at 7:30 p.m. and we'd love you to come along to that. And the ladies have a class that meets on Thursday at 10 a.m. and so ladies are welcome to come along to that as well. We also have a number of study options, and we'd love to sit down and open the Bible and study God's ambition for you. We'd love to do that at any time. Check out all of our study options and lots of good study material on our website, which is www.merseyblufc.com.au. And you'll find some very interesting things, I think, and I hope, on our website as well. But we'd hope to see you in person at one of our services. You know, there's been some wonderful advances in medical science, hasn't there? There's been wonderful treatments that have been developed. There have been wonderful diagnostic equipments that have been developed. There have been wonderful advances in pain regulation that have been developed. And so we're really living in a wonderful age as far as healthcare services go. And unfortunately, there are some who are suggesting that that's not enough. There are those who are suggesting that those who are experiencing chronic pain need to essentially have the option of dying. They need to have the option of, as they say, a dignified death or a dignified end to their suffering. So there's a lot of people that are pushing this idea of what we sometimes call euthanasia, of putting people down or putting people to death who are suffering, at least giving them that option instead of course, regulating their pain as we're so able to do today, and of course dealing with perhaps some of the psychological problems as well that these people have who want to end it all. And so they take the easy way out, which is of course to commit suicide essentially. And there are those who are pushing it in the Australian government. There are those who are pushing this idea all over the world. And of course in some countries the idea of euthanasia, this concept, has become legal. It is a legal option in some countries, particularly the Netherlands is probably the most prominent country in Western society that practices euthanasia. And they've already learned, of course, the kinds of problems that are caused by this practice, and we'll go into some of those problems as well. In the United States, it's been reported that the California Bar Association has approved of a regulation or a resolution which supports doctor-assisted suicide. And so there are pushes, of course, in the United States. In the United States, there's a doctor who's infamous, I think we can say, for promoting euthanasia or assisted suicide, and that's Dr. Kevorkian, and he's been in and out of jail, in and out of prison, because he's actually been involved in the deaths of a number of people who wanted to die because they claimed that they had chronic pain or they had difficulties in some way or another. And so he has ended the life of many so-called terminally ill people. And I say so-called because we don't always know. Doctors aren't all-knowing. You know, a doctor sometimes will make a diagnosis of a patient, but they're still not 100% sure that their diagnosis is accurate. Even with all of the great equipment that helps them make these diagnoses, even with, of course, all of the tests that they run, you know, and they're pretty sure, but they're not 100% sure. And I think we all know of cases where doctors have got it wrong. And so when they say someone is terminally ill, they can't be 100% certain that that is accurately the case. And that is one of these problems that comes up when we discuss this issue of euthanasia. Whether someone is actually terminally ill or not can be a problem. Well, in order to understand this issue properly, we have to define the term euthanasia. We have to understand what we're talking about exactly, and but in order to properly analyze it. Webster defines euthanasia as an easy death, or mercy killing, or a good death. I wouldn't define it that way, but that's the way Webster defines it. The term itself, euthanasia, actually comes from the Greek, which literally means kind of a good death. And that's what these proponents of euthanasia are suggesting, that instead of somebody suffering, they can end that suffering and have really a good death, more or less, instead of that ongoing suffering that they're experiencing. When we talk about euthanasia, there are really two types of euthanasia. There's passive euthanasia, and then there's active euthanasia. And when we talk about passive euthanasia, that's not necessarily something that's contrary to the biblical record. When we talk about passive euthanasia, that's just simply letting nature take its course without interference from the doctors. And so doctors today are able to prolong life in many different ways. For example, if someone is dying, they're able to put them on life support and sustain their life for a little bit longer. And so passive euthanasia wouldn't allow that. And so an individual says, no, I don't want you to intervene at all. You know, if I go into flatline, if I flatline or I begin to die, then don't intervene. And so people will suggest that. And that's passive euthanasia. In other words, they don't want any medical interference to help prolong their life, to extend their life in any way. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that. That's just letting nature take its course. That's just going and dying naturally. And then there's active euthanasia, which is really where we have the problem with active euthanasia, and that is one deliberately taking action to end a person's life. And so the Bible, obviously right away, as we'll look, defines that as murder, when one deliberately takes another's life. And sometimes people will deliberately take their own life. Well, that's also murder. That's self-murder. That still, of course, falls under the category of murder, even if someone commits suicide. And so active euthanasia is really the problem. And this is what we want to deal with. Well, how have different religious groups dealt with this issue of euthanasia? What's their view on euthanasia? As we look at the biggest Christian, so-called Christian group in the world, that is the Roman Catholic Church, and I use that term Christian very loosely and in the worldly sense. When we talk about Christendom, the Roman Catholic Church has typically condemned euthanasia, and of course I agree with their views on euthanasia. I think it's very good. There's one aspect I don't agree with, and that is that they classify sins. They say some sins lead to eternal damnation while other sins don't. And so they classify euthanasia as a mortal sin. In other words, if you practice euthanasia, you will be condemned throughout eternity. Whereas they might say that if you practice something like lying, which is a sin they identify, but it's not a mortal sin, and so it won't lead to eternal damnation. And so the Catholics have condemned euthanasia typically as a mortal sin, and they'll point out that the Bible says that you should not kill, and euthanasia, they say, falls under this category, and they highlight such passages in the New Testament as Matthew 5:21, Matthew 19:18, Mark 10:19, Luke 18:20, Romans 13:9, and rightfully so. These are passages that condemn murder, that reinforce that concept that God gives us that we shouldn't kill, that we shouldn't take a life. And so they say this contradicts those passages. Of course, the Catholic Church has been known to frequently change its mind on a lot of issues and change its stance on a lot of issues. And we know that the most recent Pope, Pope Francis, has been very active in doing this and changing traditional Catholic policy. And so what the Catholic Church's position on euthanasia will be in the future, I don't know. It may change, but for now they condemn it as far as I have seen from my study on this issue. Then we look at the Jewish position, which is also a condemnation of euthanasia. Generally, the Jewish faith condemns euthanasia, and they point out the various Old Testament passages, or passages particularly from the Torah, that highlight how life is precious, that it is something of great value and shouldn't be taken lightly. And certainly when someone takes a life, that shouldn't be taken lightly, and that is strongly condemned by God in the Pentateuch or the Torah. And so Jews have typically taken that view. But again, there may be some who are liberal in that faith of Judaism who might not see a problem with the practice of euthanasia. And so it can vary, of course, from individuals. Again, that is not a typical stance that may be relied upon to suggest that the Jews, or all Jews, would condemn euthanasia, because it's almost certain that some would not. And then there is the primary Protestant position, and when we talk about Protestant organizations or Protestant denominations, these were denominations founded by men, typically during the Reformation period of the 15th and 16th century. Churches like the Baptist Church, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, etc. These all represent Protestant organizations. That is, they protested against the Catholic Church. And their view has generally been also opposed to euthanasia, and they cite the teachings of Jesus, as we just mentioned before, against killing and suicide, taking life in any way, and condemning that. And certainly Jesus did do that, as the other New Testament writers did as well. And they strongly argue that doctors have no right to play God and determine when a human life should be limited. And so, once again, they would suggest that euthanasia is to be something that is to be shunned, is to be something that is condemned, certainly from a biblical view. But these various Protestant organizations are headed by different governmental bodies that meet typically annually, and they change the positions of their religious organization all the time. And so again, their particular position on euthanasia now may be different after the next meeting. We just simply do not know. It's not a reliable position, because we don't know whether they're synod or whether they're a council or committee or whatever it may be that governs this particular religious organization may change their view at any time on the subject of euthanasia. And of course, we have to understand what the Bible says on this, and we're going to look specifically at what the Bible says, and we're going to use base our view on this subject of euthanasia upon what the Bible says, which is never changing and doesn't need to be changed. And so when we think about secular arguments against euthanasia as well, we need to think about that. We need to think about humanists, for example. Let's look at the humanist position. And typically the humanists are the main proponents of euthanasia. And they're the ones that are pushing it, pushing legislation which will make it illegal in various states and nations around the world. Typically they're leading humanist who is the proponent of euthanasia that they follow, that they submit to, that humanists are particularly disciples of his way of thinking when it comes to assisted suicide and euthanasia, is a man by the name of Joseph Fletcher. And he's a well-known humanist and, of course, the primary advocate of euthanasia. He suggests concerning euthanasia that it should be legalized because it ends suffering and pain. And suffering and pain are purposeless. And so he's saying those who are dealing with chronic suffering and chronic pain, that their life really has no purpose, that pain and suffering is demoralizing, that it's degrading. Well, it's not, of course. He's very wrong in that. Pain and suffering actually has a good purpose. It has a good reason. And this is not a lesson to go into all of the good things and the positive things that come out of pain and suffering. But you can probably sit down and think about some positive things that have come out of pain and suffering. I know a lot of people who've gone through long periods of pain and suffering, perhaps through cancer or some other condition. And they talk about the fact that it's one of the best things that ever happened to them. Because they were able to wake up to some of the things that were going on in their life that weren't good, and they dismissed those things. They reevaluated their priorities in life, and it was a positive and a good thing. Pain and suffering also helps us to help others who are dealing with pain and suffering. We can be empathetic with them. We can, of course, encourage them and support them and let them know that we understand what they're going through because we went through something similar. And so pain and suffering has lots of benefits. Of course, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you need to know that that's a bad thing. And it's the pain, of course, that tells us that that's a bad thing. And so pain is a good warning system that helps us recognize that there's something wrong with our bodies, with our physical bodies. There's lots of other things that we could mention that, of course, that are connected with this. Pain is not something that's purposeless, nor is the person who's suffering with chronic pain, nor are they purposeless, nor are they demoralized by these things. They don't have to be anyway. And so he's incorrect in that kind of assessment. He goes on to say that human personality and dignity are of greater value than life itself. That's very wrong. You know, human personality and dignity. He's saying that someone who is suffering from a chronic pain is not dignified. That's not a dignified way to live. That's just cruel to suggest something like that. Then he goes on to even make an argument from the Bible, this Joseph Fletcher. He says, Jesus stated in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those that are merciful." And he goes on to say that's of equal importance as "thou shalt not kill." Well, those two things are not connected, of course, at all. And so if we're merciful, then we won't kill. That's how we see. We don't. Those who kill, those who take life, are the merciless ones. And so he misses the point altogether from Jesus' teaching. And of course, this godless, humanistic concept of euthanasia certainly doesn't gel with what the Bible teaches. Well, there are other sort of non-religious, non-secular views on euthanasia, and there are good arguments against governments putting this into law. And let's list some of those arguments against implementing euthanasia. For example, number one, if euthanasia is made legal, it would be virtually impossible to determine whether the motive of the killer, the one who put that person to death, came entirely from compassion or from greed or selfish ambition. And so, in other words, the one who is encouraging the person who is chronically ill to commit suicide or let them kill them, we don't know what their motive may be. Their motive may be for selfish purposes. And it's very sad when we have relatives who are encouraging people who are chronically ill, who are dealing with chronic pain, to end their life. You know, when they show, they're showing a lack of love and real concern, I think, for that family member who is suffering greatly. They're devaluating their life in front of them. They're saying, well, you're not that valuable to hang around anymore, so we're going to put you to death. We want you to die. We want you to commit suicide. And we don't know what their motive may be. Maybe it's out of compassion. Maybe they're just a little bit confused. But what's best to do for that person who's chronically ill? Or maybe they want their stuff. You know, maybe they're eager for their inheritance, and so they will encourage or speed up the death of their loved one. We don't really know, and that's going to be very difficult to determine. And the Netherlands has grappled with this issue. They've had euthanasia legalized for many years now, and they've had problems like this, determining the motives of those who want the chronically ill to be put to death. It's very difficult, and there are trials that have to be held in order to determine these motives in the Netherlands. And so no law having to do with so-called mercy killing or euthanasia would be able to account for every circumstances, and therefore would be either so complex as to make dying longer and less dignified, as they say, or have so few controls that certainly abuses would occur, and the legal system would be overrun with these trials trying to determine the motive of the people who are encouraging their chronically ill family member to be put to death. And so suppose terminal illness can be certainly misdiagnosis. This is another point, this is the second point that many who are not necessarily religious make, that misdiagnosis takes place all the time. You know, it's great to have doctors and nurses, and we need to trust them. I'm not suggesting that you don't trust your doctor, your specialist, your nurse, and so forth, because they have been trained, of course, in the way the human body operates and the way illness operates. They've got the latest knowledge on those things, and we do need to trust them, but they are not all-knowing. And so they make mistakes, and they make mistakes all the time. And I could mention a number of mistakes that doctors have made all the time, very good doctors, in my own personal case. I remember back in 2014, I had some problems, and so I went into the emergency room, and they did a CT scan of my brain to determine what was going on, and they found a huge lesion on the side of my brain. Well, they immediately jumped to conclusion, and this was not just one doctor, but several doctors, and they told me that they suspected I had brain cancer, that I had some kind of lymphoma and they suspected that it started in the liver and had spread to the brain, and so this was their first diagnosis. Well, that first diagnosis was actually incorrect. And so eventually, when they did a brain biopsy, they sort of realized, because I didn't die of brain cancer, that I didn't have brain cancer, and that's sort of the way they determined it. And then they sent me to a neurologist, another specialist, to determine, you know, what the lesions were on my brain, and he concluded that I had CNS vasculitis, which is another type of brain disease. But other neurologists that I saw meantime and later on thought that it wasn't CNS vasculitis, that in fact it was multiple sclerosis. And so I had 3 different diagnoses from 3 very qualified doctors. You see, doctors get it wrong. They have no idea. Now it's been determined by a general consent, I suppose you might say, not 100% consent, that I have multiple sclerosis and suffer as a result of that. And so doctors do get their diagnosis wrong. And so they started out with a diagnosis that could have led to terminal illness for me, and they ended up with a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which is not quite as life-threatening as brain cancer. And so doctors get their diagnosis wrong all the time. I know that personally, and I know other people who've had misdiagnosis as well. And so when a doctor says this patient is terminally ill, they may be wrong. Now, they may be right. I'm not suggesting that, you know, they get it wrong all the time. But they may be wrong. And so this patient is in a state of the mind of thinking that they've got terminal illness, and so it may lead them to take advantage of this option of euthanasia if it's legally available. And in fact, they may recover if they didn't, of course, commit suicide. Doctors are not 100% sure, and this is one of the biggest problems with euthanasia. That they may end up knocking people off or killing people or putting people to death through euthanasia that actually are not terminally ill. And this can be a problem that happens. And so where euthanasia is legal like the Netherlands, a mistake can be made in regard to supposed incurable diseases. The disease may be misdiagnosed, or maybe the person may be able to survive the disease. You know, there are some brain diseases, for example, since we're talking about that, you know, and they give low percentages for survival. But the fact is that if there are low percentages of survival, that means somebody survived it. And somebody has moved on with their life and been able to live a full life because they have survived this particular disease. And so, again, we've got that problem. We're not 100% sure. Doctors are not 100% sure. And there is no doubt that there are many people who've been euthanized because the doctors have misdiagnosed a disease. The other thing is, of course, that, as we mentioned at the onset of this, there are advances in medical science going on all the time. And so there may actually be a solution. There may actually be a cure for these diseases. But the person is, of course, killed, they're put to death, they're euthanized before there's opportunity to find a cure for that. And so, for example, there's no cure for multiple sclerosis, but there are many researchers who are working to find a cure for the disease that I've got. And I'm confident that even within my lifetime, they may find a cure for multiple sclerosis. And so I'll be able to benefit from that cure as well. And so we've got to give the doctors time, the researchers time as well, that may be able to find, of course, a cure for it, or may be able to find a medicine or a method in order to deal with the kinds of pain and chronic problems that come along with multiple sclerosis. But certainly the solution is not just finishing them off and putting them to death. That's no good at all. Now, when we look at the biblical perspective, let's consider that, because to us that's the most important thing. What does God view concerning this practice of euthanasia? We have a good example of God's condemnation of this practice in 1 Samuel chapter 31, and also going on into 2 Samuel chapter 1. And so right at the end of 2 Samuel, we have King Saul and his son Jonathan and the children of Israel engaged in a battle against the Philistines. And in the course of that battle, Saul dies, and so does Jonathan. In fact, we find at the end of 2 Samuel, in chapter 31 there, Saul actually committed suicide. And so he fell on his sword because he knew that the Philistines would torture him, they would torment him, they would parade him about before finally putting him to death. And so he would be displayed in that way. And so instead he chose to commit suicide. And of course the Bible doesn't condone that. Just because he did that doesn't mean that the Bible did. In fact, Saul, as we see in the latter part of his life, wasn't in a right state of mind. And this is another problem with those who choose the option of euthanasia. Are they psychologically able to make that kind of decision? And so he certainly wasn't, but he committed suicide. Well, we find an interesting episode in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and let's go over and read 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. It says, "Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had abode 2 days in Ziklag. It came even to pass on the 3rd day, that behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul, with his clothes rent and earth upon his head. And so it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the earth, and he did obeisance. And David said unto him, From whence comest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel I am escaped. And David said unto him, How went the matter? And so David is curious about the battle that had taken place between Saul and his forces and the Philistines. And he's hoping this man can give him a report. And we see what happens, he says. He says, I pray thee, tell me. And he answered, that the people are fled from battle, and many of the people who are also fallen and are dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. And David said unto the young man that told him, How knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead?
And the young man that told him said, I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa. Behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, and he saw me, and called unto me, and I answered, Here am I. And he said unto me, Who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said unto me again, Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me. For anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. And so here was this Amalekite. Now he's telling a lie, because this is not what happened. We read at the end of 2 Samuel and 2 Samuel chapter 31 that Saul actually committed suicide. He fell on his own sword. And so this Amalekite is telling David a bit of a fib. I think he's trying to gain favor with David, who had been an enemy of Saul. So perhaps we see him trying to gain some favor with David. And so he said he was the one that put Saul to death. And he says, as we've just read, I put him to death because he would have died anyway. And perhaps I saved him from being tortured and being paraded about before the Philistines, his enemies. And so I did him a favor by putting him to death, by finishing him off, because he was dead anyway. You know, he would have had a prolonged death, no doubt. If the Philistines had captured him alive, they would have paraded him and tortured him. And so I saved him from that misery. And so, in other words, this Amalekite was saying, I committed euthanasia by putting Saul to death to prevent any further misery. I hastily ended his life. Well, he's lying, but he's saying that I did this, and David doesn't know any better. He's getting his report from this young man. And so we see here that he says in verse 10, in the second part of verse 10, he says, And I took the crown that was upon his head, and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them hither unto my Lord. And so he's using this as evidence that what he said was true, even though we know it's not. Then David took hold of the clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even for Saul and Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. And David said unto the young man that told him, Whence art thou? And he said, and he answered, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. And David said unto him, How was it thou was not afraid? How was it that thou was not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. And he smote him, and he died. Now, this young man who claimed that he killed Saul, he put Saul out of his misery, he euthanized Saul to prevent any further suffering on the part of Saul. What was David's response? David is a prophet of God. He's a righteous man of God. He's an agent of God. What's his response to this Amalekite claiming that he committed euthanasia? He put him to death. You think God approves of euthanasia? He does not. He put this young man to death for claiming that he committed this act of euthanasia. Then we go over to the book of Job, and when we think about suffering servants in the Bible, I think probably, of course, Job comes to mind first. Maybe it should be Jesus, of course, who comes to mind first, or maybe one of the apostles like Paul. But certainly when we think of suffering in the Bible, we think of this character Job typically first. And we know that he suffered many things, that Satan came in and destroyed his household, took away all of his possessions, even killed his children. And covered him with boils from head to toe, from the bottom of his feet to his head. We read that poor old Job was covered with these terrible afflictions, and here he was sitting in the ash picking at his boils with a potsherd. And so what a terrible condition of suffering Job was in. He'd lost everything, lost his family except for his wife, and he was suffering this terrible disease as well. what was Job's response when his wife suggested that he should end it all, that he should commit suicide, that he should curse God and die? Let's look at those circumstances in Job chapter 2. It says in Job chapter 2, this is his wife talking to Job in this state of horrible suffering. She says to him, "Then said his wife unto him, Dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die." End it all, Job. You're suffering immensely. Why not just end it all? Curse God and die. What's Job's response to that? Here's this righteous man who it says did not sin. This was a man who kept his integrity, as even his wife noticed, of course. What's his response to his wife's suggestion? Well, he says in verse 10, "But he said to her, Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" Now, Job didn't understand that it wasn't God who had done all of these terrible things to him. It was Satan who had done all of these terrible things to him. We know that because we read in chapter 1 that Satan is the one that's behind all of this suffering that Job is experiencing, that it's evil that comes from Satan. But Job doesn't know that, and so he makes this statement. But he's not willing to offend God. And so he's not willing to part ways with God. He's not willing to do this that she suggested, to finish off his suffering by committing suicide. And he says, "You talk like one of the foolish women. It's a foolish thing that you're suggesting." And that's exactly what these humanists are. They're fools. They're suggesting something foolish by suggesting that people ought to be euthanized, that are suffering, that are enduring immense pain, like Job was enduring. Kind of mental anguish that he was suffering because he had lost his children. The kind of terrible physical pain he was enduring because of the disease that afflicted his body. But he would not commit suicide. He called this foolishness to end your life in such a way. And it says at the end of verse 10, "In this did not Job sin with his lips." So this was the right thing to do. This is what God wanted. God wanted him to recognize that his life was still worth the living despite the kind of terrible suffering he was going through. And because Job didn't follow his wife's advice and end his life in this period of terrible suffering in which there was no light at the end of the tunnel, we see at the end of the book of Job that Job actually recovered. In fact, he continued to have a family, had more children, and he was blessed greatly. And so he lived a very comfortable life. But what if Job had ended it here, as his wife has suggested? Because he was experiencing tremendous, what it seemed like, endless suffering. Well, he wouldn't have received the wonderful things he received at the end of the book of Job and went on to live a full life. And so again, the Bible condemns euthanasia, of ending somebody's life because they may have some chronic illness or difficulties or even other problems that might be going in their life, like mental anguish. It may not necessarily be physical language. The fact is that when we look at the Bible, we see that life is precious. And of course we need to treat it in that way. Those who promote euthanasia, these humanists, they cheapen life. They're motivated by the theory of evolution, which has unfortunately been taught in our schools for many decades, which suggests that we're nothing more than any of the other animals. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that human life is special. Right at the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we're told there that we're made in the image of God. Only human beings are made in the image of God. And that entails, of course, a lot. And there's been much that's been written on that particular statement, that we're made in the image of God. But, of course, we have an eternal soul. We have a soul that God put within us that will live forever. And that's one of those blessings that God has only given to human beings, that eternal soul. And so we have that great blessing. Human life is very precious. It's made in the image of God. Over in the New Testament, in the book of John, in John chapter 15 and verse 13, Jesus emphasized how precious life is, that we shouldn't treat it carelessly or flippantly. We shouldn't dismiss it and end it just whenever we have a few problems in life. It says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. What's Jesus saying? He's saying the most precious possession you have is your life, aside from your soul, which he also emphasizes. But the most precious physical possession you have is your life. It's the greatest gift you can give to somebody. That's what he says here in John chapter 15 and verse 13. The Bible teaches that life is precious, that life is sacred, and we shouldn't treat it flippantly as those who are proponents of euthanasia do. It's contrary to that. What do we do with those who are physically in pain, those who are in are experiencing chronic pain, or maybe even some constant psychological issues that torment them? What do we do? Well, the Bible tells us what we do there as well. That we support them, that we give them purpose in life. We help them, we aid them, we assist them. And there are numerous passages throughout the Bible that encourage the people of God to help those who are in need, who are suffering from physical problems or circumstances in their life that are very difficult, or even psychological torment. James 1:27, for example, tells us to look after the fatherless or the orphans, and to look after widows and see to their needs. Isaiah 1 verses 11 and verse 23, Romans 15:1, Leviticus 19:32, Psalm 71:9, the list goes on, talking about the need to have compassion for those who are suffering. It's our responsibility to help those people. It's our responsibility to help them find purpose in life. And that's what the Bible does. God has an ambition for every human being. He wants every human being to live for Him and to live forever. He's got an ambition for us. He's got a purpose for our life. And we need to share that purpose with other people. Give them meaning in their life. Even though they may be suffering and have difficulties and problems, we need to help them find a way to have a purpose for life. A reason for living. That is our responsibility. And that's what all these people who are filled with compassion and mercy for those who are suffering should do. They should help them to find a purpose and meaning in life. And so these are things that we must do in order to help these people. And so euthanasia is something that is strongly condemned by the Bible. It's something that the Bible says should not be done. And it's something, of course, that really doesn't make sense when we break it down and look at the ins and outs of it. There are lots of arguments that could be made, reasonable, sensible, logical arguments against this practice of euthanasia. We need to treat life as something that is precious, a wonderful, precious gift from God. We need to help people find purpose and meaning in their life. Let me just close by telling you the story of a good friend of mine who recently had an accident about a year ago, and he broke his spine and broke his spinal cord, and he couldn't walk anymore. He's a paraplegic. He suffers chronic pain as a result of his condition. But this is a man who continues on. This is a man who continues to work hard. He does what he can. He has physical limitations. He's limited sometimes, I think, by his pain that's ongoing. But he does what he can in his work for the Lord. He's a preacher of the gospel. He continues to move on. He's got purpose. He's got meaning in life. And despite the accident that he's had, he still has a reason to live. God gave him that purpose. God gave him that reason. That's what we need to do for those who are suffering and having difficulties. We need to give them a reason and a purpose in life, and God provides that in His Word. Thank you for joining me.